Guests of Brennan House.
Colonel Rob Maness has a lifelong record of providing dedicated service to this nation. Having worked his way up from the enlisted ranks to full colonel, he served our country for more than 32 years. He has served as a bomber squadron commander, bomb disposal technician, Joint Chiefs of Staff Operations Officer, assisted the National Security Team with the campaign plan for the global war on terrorism. He authored the first theater nuclear war plan and served as the Vice Commander of America's largest airborne intelligence wing. Colonel Rob Maness is a true American hero. This is Rob Maness Live.
The Silent Erosion: How Christian Universities Lose Their Faith and Identity. Dr. John G. West's 12-year experience at Seattle Pacific University reveals how Christian institutions gradually abandon their founding principles. The surprising culprits? Not liberal faculty, but conservative board members who lacked the courage of their convictions. The critical turning point came when SBU's president removed denominational control of the board, following the classic pattern of how Christian universities secularize. By 2005, Free Methodist representation dropped to just 1/3 of the board, leading to a situation where 72% of faculty eventually rejected biblical teachings on marriage. This cautionary tale demonstrates how institutional decline typically begins with governance changes that weaken accountability to founding churches.
The hidden reasons behind failing Christian institutions. Welcome back to Whistleblower Wednesday. The Rob Maness Show is live on Worldview Tube, our X Spaces simulcast, Rumble, YouTube, Truth Social Plus, Amazon Fire, Apple TV, and Roku. Well, with the Trump administration pushing to end DEI indoctrination in public universities and penalizing schools out of control with anti-Semites protesting on campuses, we're finally witnessing an administration that is doing something about failing educational institutions, including Christian universities. And I look forward to seeing Christian leaders stepping up to push for positive change in our institutions back to biblical principles and as far away from secularism as is humanly possible. But how did we get here in the first place? Was it due to leftist professors overtaking these institutions? Well, you just heard no. What lessons do we need to absorb and implement solutions based on those lessons in order to get back on track and save our society and its Christian institutions? Because this really is about society. Well, my guest today, you just heard from him there, Dr. John West, is going to help us find answers and solutions. He's the author of the book, Stockholm Syndrome Christianity, Why America's Christian Leaders Are Failing and What We Can Do About It. Dr. West holds a PhD in government from Claremont, is vice president of the Discovery Institute, and an award-winning author and filmmaker who has written or edited 12 books. Dr. West, welcome to the Rob Maness Show.
Colonel, thank you for having me.
Well, I appreciate you coming on. You know, this is some people in my audience may think, well, this is a little bit out of Maness's wheelhouse here, but really it's not, because when I first read about you in this book, I'm like, why has nobody really blown the whistle on this issue before as to where this stuff's coming from? So let's just dive right into it. What is Stockholm Syndrome Christianity?
Yeah, so the Stockholm Syndrome, for people who don't know, remember, comes from this infamous bank robbery in the 1970s in Stockholm, Sweden, where something strange happened. That basically after these hostages were held by submachine gun by these robbers, that by the end of the experience, they were feeling grateful towards their captors and thought their captors were good people and good guys. And so they sort of identified more with their captors than with sort of the police and other people. And so I use this in my book. I think it explains a lot of leading self-identified Christians, leaders in government, in the arts and entertainment, in academia certainly, how they end up adopting the point of view of their cultural captors. You know, if they've spent time going through graduate school or, say, in journalism, surrounded by left-wing journalists, some of these self-identified Christians, they end up identifying more with the worldview of those surrounding elites than they do with their fellow people in the pews or their historic, Christian teachings, for example.
Yeah. it's really strange. I hadn't really, I mean, I knew about Stockholm Syndrome, but I hadn't really married these two ideas up yet. And the other thing that was pointed out in the little opening clip there is about who is doing it. You know?
Yeah.
But first, what are the symptoms? You know, how does somebody? I'm a Christian.
Sure.
I'm a Protestant. Southern Baptist is what I am.
Yep.
How do I recognize that this rot is happening? Because I think a lot of this is it's insidious, nuanced, over time, gradual nature of it. But there has to be a set of symptoms that folks have identified, like you, that have worked in this industry.
Yeah, well, I think for those of us who are Christians, I think that the number one thing out of which virtually everything else flows is when people start undercutting the authority of the Bible. And when they start being embarrassed by it, then it leads into other things. And you can see this among, actually, unfortunately, among Baptists as well as Presbyterians, as well as you name it. So Andy Stanley is someone I write about in my book, is one of the nation's largest megachurch pastors. He's a Baptist, but he wrote a whole book attacking the Old Testament as the obsolete Testament, and basically saying it should be moved to the back of our Bibles and blaming it for everything evil, and saying that the Bible can't be defended in the public square anymore, and so that we really shouldn't even try. And this is from a pastor who trains thousands of other pastors. He's a self-identified evangelical Baptist. And so, but then it plays out. If you actually look at other things that Andy Stanley, after he sort of started these views on the Bible, now he basically has bailed on a really biblical view of marriage. On politics, he's very left-wing. So it has played out into all sorts of other areas, but where it really started was he was embarrassed by the Bible. And I think you see that with a lot of these people. And then, when people are sounding more like the world around them than, the traditional teachings of their faith, then I think that is a huge warning sign. But it often starts by devaluing and undercutting or running away from the Bible.
So, look, I mean, I'm not a student of the Bible by any means, but I have some really good fundamental understanding that the Bible is the truth. It's the Word of God. And I'll go back to the opening clip. The one example in there was about marriage. It's very clear. As long as you don't throw the Old Testament out with the bathwater like Andy wants to do, God created man and woman. And he created the institution of marriage. And why can't Christian leaders grasp onto that basic, simple truth without letting it get muddied up way it's happened? Because apparently that's what's happened. That's one of the things that's happened.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's what they're doing is, in a way, I mean, you could say brainwashed, but so it's not just, was the insight that I had of the people I knew who were falling away like this. It's not just that some of them lack spines or are cowardly, there is some, or want the praise of the world. That is certainly true among some, but a lot of these people are very sincere. They think they're standing for truth, but what they think is truth is they're actually buying into the assumptions and beliefs of the surrounding culture. And it's not just on marriage, it's on DEI, it's on abortion and life issues, it's on, frankly, among a lot of evangelical Christian institutions, certainly the one that I was a professor at for 12 years, there's a lot of hatred toward Israel. And where are they getting this? They're actually not getting it from their faith tradition, they're getting it from the surrounding elites. And so they ended up, Christians were called to be salt and light to the culture.
Right.
But what turns out with some of these Christian leaders is rather than bringing, say, Christian truth to the culture, they're so bought into the assumptions of the surrounding elites that they view it more as their mission to convince their fellow Christians not to be so stupid, to basically to adapt to the surrounding culture. So if anything, they become missionaries from the secular elites to their fellow Christians. And that happens, and they think that they're standing courageously for truth because they're standing against what they consider the cultural yahoos who are in, either their students. I saw that a lot among, my fellow faculty members viewing students who had come from, theologically, morally, politically conservative families being, oh, they're not as sophisticated as we are, so we have to train them into the truth, which turned out to be left-wing garbage usually. And so that's the mentality. They think they're actually standing for truth. They think they're being courageous, but it's because they're getting their peer groups is not the Bible or the historic Christian teachings for the past 2,000 years. It's these secular elites that they've really bought into, sometimes unconsciously, sometimes fully consciously.
Yeah, so one of the things you identified, the core issue with the universities themselves is that you have conservative Christians sitting on the boards of directors or boards of whatever mechanism you want to call it for these universities. And they are the ones that are actually caving in, walking away from biblical principles and embracing this. It just puzzles me because the truth is in the biblical principle. No matter what you look at it, how do they get past that?
Yeah, no, I'm glad. This is one key reason why I wanted to write this book, is because those outside of academia, I don't think really understand the dynamics. So yes, obviously, left-wing professors and administrators are pushing, what they want to push, but who allows it? And so, just for people who don't know, the elite institutions in America right now, like Harvard, Princeton, Yale, Columbia, all were started as devoutly Christian institutions. But by the mid-19th century, they weren't anymore. So those were lost, and now they're sort of completely lost. So then at the end of the 19th century, particularly evangelical Protestants, founded a whole new group of institutions, hoping that they would do what Harvard, Princeton, Dartmouth no longer did. And they were faithful for many years, but for what we're seeing now in the past couple of decades, but particularly the last decade, is that many of these faith-based institutions are starting to go the same way as the first generation institutions. And really the key determinant, and it was at my school, but I've seen it at other schools, is you have these generally politically, theologically, morally conservative boards of trustees that do not have the backbone or the courage of their convictions, or are convinced by the faculty, well, you're not an expert, so just defer to us. Don't just rubber stamp for tenure and permanent positions the people we bring. Don't ask hard questions. And a lot of the board members, they are intimidated by that because they say, we're not experts, we're from business, or we're pastors from the church, or whatever. We're not experts, so we just defer. But the key thing, is that if you're a board member of a faith-based institution, your number one goal, and this is true whether it's a K through 12 school, a university, a church for that matter, if you're a board member, your number one goal is to safeguard the mission of your organization. And so to be told that you can't do that, or you should just defer to what the staff or faculty say, and that you can't ask tough questions, or that you can't lay down the law, that's how institutions are changed. And in fact, to give you a sort of snapshot at the institution where I was a professor for 12 years, when I was hired, the board was actually very active. And I was actually warned by some more liberal faculty that said, oh, we have a very conservative board of trustees, and they even denied tenure to someone in the Bible department, in the theology department, because he was sort of out there. And so they thought, so you need to be careful. Little did they know that when I heard that privately in my own heart, I was saying, great, they actually have a board who understands it, who's defending the integrity of the institution. Fast forward 12 years when I decide, when I decided to leave. By that time, there was actually a very outstanding faculty member who had been recruited, who happened to be both theologically and politically conservative, and he was denied tenure, in my view, for bogus grounds. And yet the board rubber stamped that. So we went from a board actually laying down the law and actually upholding and removing someone who didn't fit the mission of the institution, to at the end rubber stamping the faculty's, the woke faculty's effort to get rid of someone because they were too theologically, morally, politically conservative. And so that's sort of in a snapshot what happened at my institution. And I have friends at other Christian institutions, and this has happened similarly, where, again, the board is AWOL. And so although I am critical of the woke faculty who are trying to do what they think is right, but I think is wrong, the thing about these board members is many of them don't actually fundamentally agree with the woke faculty, but they're not willing to do what takes to safeguard their institution.
Yeah. Well, we got to take a commercial break, Dr. West. When we come back, though, we're going to continue this discussion about leadership. I'm interested in your thoughts on what you talk about in the book. Some of them are the other examples of so-called leaders that are absolutely failing because they've walked away from biblical principles that we know are the truth. We'll be right back with Dr. John West.
But with Brannon, it's always cutting edge stuff happening in the world, and it's not just from the political angle, because you can get that on other platforms, but it's always from the biblical angle. So you're dealing with a guy that loves Jesus, you're dealing with a guy that's very intelligent, you're dealing with a guy that is cutting edge conservatism, and you're dealing with a guy that wants to be biblical all at the same time. And so for that reason alone, I hope many, many people will not just lift up his ministry in prayer, but will also financially get behind it, because from the angle I'm trying to describe, he really is the only game in town. And we desperately need it in these last days. Can I get an amen to that?
What if America isn't collapsing because of crusading secularists? What if it's failing because leading Christians identify more with secular elites than with their fellow believers? That's the thesis of my new book, Stockholm Syndrome Christianity, which exposes how influential Christian leaders are siding with anti-Christian elites when it comes to sex, race, science, religious liberty, and even biblical authority. If you're concerned about the corruption of American Christianity, and more importantly, what to do about it, I'd invite you to read my book. More than a critique, it offers practical strategies for how you can stand for truth in your family, your church, and your community. Be part of the solution, not part of the problem. Find out more at StockholmSyndromeChristianity.com.
Welcome back to the Rob Maness Show. It's Whistleblower Wednesday, and we're talking with that man right there, the author of Stockholm Syndrome Christianity, about that. The subtitle of that is Why Christian Leaders Are Failing, and they're failing institutions like Christian universities. Dr. West, you mentioned you were a professor, I think, for 12 years or more at Seattle Pacific University, SPU. And so you witnessed as a professor both your colleagues, but also the leaders that are supposed to be the Christian leaders on the board and those kind of things. What were some of the other things that they were doing to undermine the Christian base of their universities?
Yeah, so among the faculty, and of course it got worse after I left, but when you talk about sort of Israel and and the Palestinians, there was really only one true view on our campus, and that was you had to support the Palestinians. If you talked about abortion, now there was more of a diverse on abortion, but I remember dealing with a student in my department when I was department chair, where one of the other faculty members was trying to shame her because she didn't support abortion, and I tried to deal with that. And so theologically, we were dealing with issues of something called open theism, which was the idea that God himself doesn't know the future, which, I mean, basically all Christians, Catholic, Protestant, Eastern Orthodox, have always believed that God is omniscient and also that he knows the future as well as the past. This was directly saying the opposite. And so I'd have students, I was a political science professor, who'd come into me distraught, and I'd try to give them other resources so that they wouldn't be so that they would have a more traditional view. But those were so. And then obviously after I left, they became in the grip of some of the woke, what I would call racism of the left, some of the woke DEI things and speech codes and things on. It's really interesting that when I was there, I would bring in conservative speakers on a variety of issues, theologically, morally, politically, and I was accused sometimes of being not a good colleague because I was bringing in people who my colleagues disagreed with. And so they weren't really even for, this was before cancel culture was a thing, but they weren't, a lot of the other faculty really didn't want to be challenged with views on campus, articulate views that, they disagreed with because they wanted to propagandize the students without an alternative view. So, all of this, though, was enabled ultimately by the board, whether they knew it or not. And I talk about in my book how what I consider one of the watershed sort of turning points was when the president at the time tried to basically transform the board to basically hand-pick people, whereas before it was largely chosen by the sponsoring denomination, the Free Methodist Church, which is a pretty conservative group. And this became a major controversy, and the board flinched. The board didn't actually authorize it, but when they found out what the president was doing, neither did they sack him, and so he ultimately did get his way. And there were a few of us who tried to, well, we did. We alerted the board. We made arguments for why this is a bad thing. And basically the board simply decided to, in my view, flinch and didn't have the spine to actually, they should have dismissed the president, actually, in my view. And when they didn't do that, then I think it was all downhill from there because they made clear that there was really nothing that the president or the faculty could do that would, that they would put a stop to it. And so.
Yeah. Wow. Courage is, especially moral courage. Moral courage is hard to come by these days, isn't it?
Yeah, I think, courage seems to be come by the people on the left and the woke. They will go broke for anything. But you're right. I think among more traditionally and more conservative-minded people, that can often be hard. And it's not just in academia. I mean, maybe we can talk about some of the things outside of it, but in government, I mean, over the last decade, the most powerful scientist in America was a self-identified evangelical Christian, Francis Collins. But if you actually, and he made a lot about his personal Christian testimony, which I don't question, but if you look at how he governed as the head of the National Institutes of Health, as the most powerful science official in America. I mean, he was Anthony Fauci's boss. So, I mean, yeah. Francis Collins was powerful, and he wore his Christianity on his sleeve. But how did he govern? Well, one, he oversaw millions of our tax dollars being spent to create a tissue bank harvesting body parts from late-term aborted babies, up to 42 weeks in gestation. For research. For what sorts of research? Research like this one, where they actually took scalps from little babies, aborted babies, and grafted them into mice. I mean, humanized rodent experiments. I mean, this is done by the nation's most pronounced evangelical Christian scientist. And then even worse, well, equally bad to that is he spent even more millions of dollars funding the most extreme of the gender madness. People, doctors that were cutting off the breasts of young women, that were filling both young men and young women filled with puberty blockers. We spent millions more on his watch at the National Institutes of Health on that. And then let alone during the COVID, and I know that people have different views, but I would say that one thing Christians should have agreed on is that if you had fellow Christians who had, sincere conscience objections to taking the COVID vaccine, they should not have been demonized, and they should not have been penalized. And yet, Francis Collins was a ringleader in weaponizing "Love Thy Neighbor" and turning it into a club to actually not love his fellow Christians who didn't want to take the COVID vaccination, and in fact, even becoming a cheerleader of unconstitutional draconian mandates where thousands upon thousands of people, not just Christians, but Americans lost their jobs and livelihoods because of these unconstitutional mandates. And if they didn't take that vaccination, they would lose their job. And Francis Collins was one of the ringleaders in pushing that. And so here we have, I think, a classic Stockholm Syndrome Christian, so he has a devout personal faith, but it does not translate into his public policies. And his public policies really are indistinguishable from the secular left. So whatever his personal faith is, his actual actions as a government official was indistinguishable. And in fact, he was praised by left-wing journalists who were saying, oh, we were sort of fearful. I quote this in my book. I think the journal Slate and then the magazine Science, they both, we had qualms because he was such an outspoken Christian, but we shouldn't have had qualms, they basically said, because he did basically everything we wanted him to do. And if he helped deflect these conservative anti-abortion people because he was a Christian, and so that it was harder for them to attack him, that was great. I mean, what a terrible epitaph to someone, if you're a Bible-believing Christian, to be being praised by the secular left because you did basically what they wanted.
Yeah, and it goes on and on and on, Dr. West. You brought Francis Collins up. I mean, you've heard of the Religious Freedom Restoration Act that was passed after the anthrax vaccine issue in the military. The military leadership crushed religious requests for exemptions from the vaccine, and there are tens of thousands of people out of the military right now that were very smart, independent-minded thinking, critically thinking Americans that were good soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, and Guardians and Coast Guards, men and women. And we can't get them to come back in, even though this president has said it's okay and is setting up processes to do that are supposed to be fair, because they look at it and go, well, there's been no accountability. Nobody's been held accountable for crushing our religious freedom rights. And Collins also, what else did he do? He stopped people from going to church and intervened on their First Amendment freedom of religion rights. And people were even arrested in some states because, and all it would have taken would have been a word from somebody like him to go, wait a minute, no, that's the wrong policy to do. But he didn't have the courage to do it, or he just thought he was right. That's one of the things that I wanted to ask you about, because you do point that out in your book, is that these people, and you pointed it out in the last segment, these people, some of them actually think they are doing what's right and the truth. How does that play into the anti-Semitism, though? Because that makes absolutely no sense to a Christian like me.
Well, I think in that era, for the people who I knew, like my fellow college professors, it comes down to my book. I have a chapter on where do you get your information from? Who are you listening to? And I think a lot of the people that you see, and this is true of Collins, I think Collins is sincere. I think he's sincerely wrong. And I think the big problem with Collins is he's afraid to hear critical views. And I talk about this in the book, whether it be the issues we were talking about or others, he was really insulated, and he basically made sure he was insulated. He didn't really want critical views or to have to defend his views with other evidence-based things. And so when you couple that with the unwillingness to hear other views, and then the tunnel vision that you're only listening to certain sources, then it's sort of inevitable in a way that you're going to come up with bad views. And so on Israel, in my experience, the Christians who end up being very anti-Israel or very pro-Palestinian, Hamas, if you will, today, I mean, before it wasn't just Hamas, is that they listen to the one-sided propaganda that demonizes Israel, and they take that as a factual description. They actually think Israel is engaging in genocide, rather than actually Israel has been very long-suffering in how it's tried to handle a very difficult situation. And so they actually believe those facts. So I think one of the key things, if you want to protect yourself, your church, your kids from Stockholm Syndrome Christianity, is you need to be, listening to shows like this one or other. There are a lot of good alternative media sources now that if you listen to, you will get more information. But even the friends of mine that I know, if they only read, say, the Atlantic magazine or the New York Times or CNN, I can sort of predict and have seen, sadly, where people end up going because they think that's reality. And so one of the things, where do you get your information from? And that is one of the, and where do your kids get their information from? Where does your church members get their information from? And what voices are they listening to? Because that will help determine what they think reality is and will feed into their views.
Yeah. Wow. We got to take another break, sir. When we come back, though, I want to get your take on some of the ways that Christian leaders that are in these hallowed halls, in these rooms, in these conversations, and how can we push back in a loving way to try to get things turned around? I'll be right back with Dr. John West, author of the Stockholm Syndrome Christianity. What a subject, and it's amazing. You got to get the book. I'll be right back.
Hello, I'm Brandon House. I want to thank you for all your support at wvwfoundation.com that helps make possible pushing out 24/7 content for free. Without your support, we'd have to put it all behind a paywall. But thanks to you and your support through our foundation, we're able to push it out for free as a broadcast service and broadcast ministry of WVW Foundation. Please consider going there and setting up an automatic monthly contribution, or go there and make an occasional contribution. If you prefer to support us through the mail, you'll find our mailing address there at wvwfoundation.com. You can also call and make your contribution over the phone by calling 901-825-0652. That's 901-825-0652. Again, all these details are available at wvwfoundation.com. Thank you for your support as we try to help people around the world understand the times through the lens of a Christian worldview.
You're causing me to remember a story at Westmont College, my alma mater that hires pro-abortion professors, Eric. Hires them, and I could tell you their names because I had emailed debates with these professors, right? And my alma mater's motto is Christ preeminent in all things. And so I would always joke with the intellectual, academic, Deutsche Christens-like professors there by saying, was Christ preeminent from the moment he was human? The moment of conception? Oh, right. So therefore every other child would be. And so you're hiring professors that are actually committing a Christological heresy by being pro-choice, which would maintain that Christ was at some point fully God, but not fully human. I digress.
Welcome back to the Rob Maynard Show. It's Whistleblower Wednesday, and we're blowing the whistle on Christian leaders and institutions in America, like universities, that really have lost their way because they've turned their back on simple biblical principles. And my guest today is Dr. John West, who's been a professor before at a Christian university, has been a leader in Christian denominations, has made documentaries, has edited or written 12 books, and his latest book is Stockholm Syndrome Christianity. And he's talking with us today. And you can go to Amazon and find that. Just Google those words, Stockholm Syndrome Christianity. It'll pop right up. You got to get this book because it not only identifies where the issue is in Christian universities, but it also talks about what some solutions are. Dr. West, I'm reminded of I said this might not be in my wheelhouse. Some people might not think so, but look, I'm on the board of advisors for a group called Stand Together Against Racism and Radicalism in the Services, or STARS. It was started by Air Force Academy graduates. I'm not one, but I was asked to be on the board of advisors after the group formed, but it was to fight DEI at the Air Force Academy. And some of the things you're seeing Secretary Hegseth and President Trump implement right now are ideas that came from the very smart members of that group. But one of the things that I noticed is exactly what you're talking about, but from a professional perspective. It took the professionals, the general officers, the colonels, the chief master sergeants to implement these ideas at the service academy, in this case, the Air Force Academy. And the only way it was accepted by young people coming in as a real viable path to becoming a good leader in the military was through them. And many of them to this day think they were doing what's right and the truth, even though they are being told no. And all those policies have been turned around, defunded. But just today, an article came out about Air Force Academy graduates saying transgenders should be allowed to serve in the military. It makes us stronger, which is the absolute furthest thing from the truth. So you got a chapter or two in your book about, proposed solutions and what we can do. One of the first things I wanted to ask you was, are there some organizations that Christians can join that are just concerned citizens, parents, grandparents, professors, that may be organized around the country to help face down these issues?
Yeah, so there are certainly a lot of different organizations focusing on specific topics. And so I think, if people go to my website, StockholmSyndromeChristianity.com, under the resources section, they'll find a lot of resources, media outlets that they could be listening to, but also some organizations. So like most states have family policy councils that will help things. But in all honesty, when dealing with like reforming Christian higher education or K through 12 schools or others, it's, there are some professional organizations, but not so much, and certainly not to sort of train board members. I'd say, there are various things people can do. If you're, and I talk about this, but if you happen to be a board member or you know someone who's a board member of any Christian organization, helping to train those board members or yourself about what you can do is really important. I give about 5 or 6 concrete suggestions. One of the things I think board members need to do is focus on, there's this principle from politics, and since I'm a recovering political science professor, I like to use this example, is that people are policy. And that, you can have the best formal statements in the world, faith statements, statements of mission, but if you hire people who really don't believe it, what actually happens in the organization and in the schools, it would be in the classroom, is going to be the opposite of that. And so the focusing on the right people and getting rid of the wrong people is one of the most important things that a board can do. And sometimes, I've been on various boards. The new lingo now is boards are encouraged to not get so involved in micromanaging, what's happening in their organizations. Now, there's some truth to that, but if you're in an organization that's gone south, you're going to have to micromanage, at least making sure that you hire the right people and get rid of the bad people. And so this is as simple as, if someone's coming up for tenure, actually finding out what are their views on hot button other issues. What are they, you can even go out into social media and find it. If it's hiring someone in your church, I give some examples where the way that often works is someone suggests it and you never ask the tough questions of some of the hot button issues. And so you don't really find out until it's too late, till after you've hired them, after they have a base of operations in your institution and it's hard to get rid of them. So focusing on the people you hire and fire is probably one of the most important things that a board can do. But there are also other techniques. If your organization is being infiltrated by DEI sorts of thinking or other things, is if you're a board member, you can ask for a discussion on something, and depending on whether they follow Robert's Rules of Orders or other things, you may if you just get 1 or 2 other people to agree with you, be able to put an item on for discussion. And a lot of these things flourish, especially in Christian institutions, in darkness. Yeah. In other words, because the people who are promoting them are fearful of allowing an open discussion. Well, if you're a board member, you often can force an open discussion among the board. And you may end up building new allies on that board when you actually have to discuss what's happening. So I'd say 2 things: focus on the who you're hiring and firing, and then also on focus on the other things with regard to your board of hot button issues that you want you demand that they be discussed in the light of day. Because once you have the discussion and people realize what you're actually doing, you may end up developing a different policy. So that's with board members, but there are other things. So I talk about the principle of do no harm. Say you're not a board member, but you're an active member of a church or Christian organization or an active alumni of one. How are you spending your time, talent, and treasure? This is something each one of us can do, no matter how powerful or lack of power we are, is how are we using our own time, talent, and treasure? And I use an example in my book of people who I knew who were part of a large megachurch that historically was pretty biblically faithful, but then the pastor sort of went off the deep end and embraced gay marriage. And these, many of the couples and families in this church didn't agree with that. But because of their emotional connection to the church, because of their small groups, because of their personal connections, they stayed and kept writing checks. Well, I think if you do that, you're worse than the Stockholm Syndrome Christians, because at least the Stockholm Syndrome Christians are doing what they think is right, even though they're misled. But if you know it's wrong and you're still writing a check, or you're volunteering your time, or you're helping to support it, you're worse, because you're actually supporting and enabling something that you really yourself know to be wrong. And with, some of this, the donors who make these things possible, especially for Christian colleges, they require a lot of donations and so they get a lot of donations from alumni who have warm, fuzzy feelings back on, 2 decades ago when they went there. But if they realize that it has gone south, they need to stop writing the checks. That will add some, that in and of itself won't change it, because woke people will go down with the ship. But it will at least be a wake-up call for the board, and it may precipitate a discussion where some of the good people that may be left on, say, a board can actually push things, home. So I think each of us, how are we using our own things? And then obviously, if you're a pastor or a Christian teacher, it's not just what you say, it's what you don't say. So if there's it's a fake quote, Martin Luther never said it, but he should have said it, that if you are focusing and teaching truth, but not on the 1 or 2 areas where the devil is really hitting home in your culture. So if you're teaching truth in other areas, but not where the battle is really joined, then, you're not really preaching truth. Because if all you're saying is things that, no one disagrees with, but say there are 2 or 3 points of Christian truth that are really being savaged in your culture, and it's going the other way, and you're not willing to speak out on that, where the battle actually is, you're really not fighting the battle. And so I do think that pastors, but small group leaders, Sunday school teachers, let alone K through 12 Christian teachers, need to not only make sure that what they're saying is good, but are they actually addressing those culture points? And I would say in our culture, sex, life, race, poverty, these are all issues where the dominant messages in our culture are really going in the opposite direction of historic Christian teaching. And so those are some of the areas that you have to intentionally talk about and train kids about, and train people in your church about.
Yeah, that's a great point. As I was prepping for the show, I came across a clip of Charlie Kirk, the guy that founded Turning Point. He's a very devout Christian, and he was having a discussion, and they were trying to debating a young woman, and he was trying to explain to her why DEI was unbiblical, and he used the example of, think about it this way. If something is wrong, then you could be fired for it. And if you could make fun of a black person, would you be fired for that? But if you would make fun of a white male today in a university, would you be fired for that? And that was the example he used, because as a white male, you wouldn't get fired for making fun of a white male 9 times out of 10 today, because that's where the part of this battle is with DEI is white males. Where with a black person, you make fun of them, you're gone immediately. And that example, I think, kind of lines up with what you were just talking about. You got to fight the battle where the actual fight is. And what's going on. You can't just talk around the periphery of this stuff. And DEI is just riddled with examples of that. Well, the white male issue is one of them. The pro-DEI guys and gals, they like to say how, this is all about teamwork. It makes us stronger that we understand each other. But that's not really what's happening. It's a Marxist tool to divide us.
Yeah, I think many of the Christians who embraced various forms of DEI, whatever they called it, they were doing it because they thought that they were being kind and sort of promoting human equality and things, even though it's really not based on that. And they also didn't want to be tagged with be criticized in certain ways. But what they didn't realize is that by giving into that, rather than I think the Bible is the best engine for human equality and dignity that in the history of human civilization. And so, but rather than grounding their efforts in true teachings about respect for others and that we're all created in God's image and that and from that human rights come, and but instead of doing that, by adopting this neo-Marxian, this really race-based, really permanent idea that the races are at war with each other and that there is no underlying human equality where we're all sort of brothers and sisters created in the image of God. By going down that route in the name of compassion and justice and things, what they did is send a whole generation of young men that Christianity doesn't really affirm, this is all a lie. Anything about human dignity is lie. And so you've actually seen a reaction on the fringe that's very disturbing to me on the right of people who are genuine racists now, who are arguing for, they say, yeah, well, DEI, that ideology is right. We're all embraced in our particular race, and therefore, since we're white, so we should be supreme. And these are some of the people on the internet who are praising Hitler and attacking Jews, and so, and they're a fringe. But I think what the people who supported, the Christians who embraced this race-based ideology of DEI, they need to own up to that by failing to preach true biblical equality, they created a vacuum for a generation of some disaffected young white males who've now gone to some very bad things because Christians failed to teach the true teaching of biblical equality, which has nothing to do with DEI. And by not doing that, they ceded the ground. And this is, in a little different way, you see the people like Andrew Tate and things who are just absolutely no Christian should support someone like Andrew Tate, who demeans women. It's just awful. But a vacuum was created because some leading Christians failed to really extol biblical masculinity, and to be so down on, sort of basically buying into the ultra-feminism and not having a doctrine that for male courage and how men should defend their families and their country. And if you create a vacuum, bad things happen.
Absolutely right, sir. Well, we got to take one more break and one segment left. I want to dive into that, how Christian leaders can take this bull by the horns, and you go into it in your book, and we can turn this around, and especially the core Christian leadership in our society, all the way down to our communities and neighborhoods. I'm talking with Dr. John Wesley, author of Stockholm Syndrome, Christianity, and how Christian leaders are failing places like the institutions of Christian University. We'll be right back.
A Christian college is asking the Supreme Court to take up a case on gender identity and dorms. A Biden administration directive would force the school to allow members of the opposite sex to share dorms rooms depending on a student's gender identity. And now Missouri's College of the Ozarks is fighting back. Attorneys for the Christian college argue the directive would violate biblical principles and traditional Christian beliefs regarding sex and marriage. The move comes after an appeals court ruling against the school. And here with us now is Tony Perkins, president of the Family Research Council. Tony, welcome. Good to have you on tonight. So let's start with this case involving College of the Ozarks and gender identity. What kind of implications are there for college women in a case like this?
Well, there's a significant ramifications for the women when it comes to privacy. But look, this is an issue, a First Amendment issue for a religious institution. Now, the ruling against them was based on standing. They're being preemptive in this, and you know, this is one of those cases where an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, especially when it comes to the First Amendment for a religious institution and, as you pointed out, the privacy of women. So I applaud them for standing up and fighting back against this evil ideology being pushed by this administration. In fact, every American should not be silent, but speaking up, pushing back and saying, we're not going to have any of this. So I applaud the leadership there at the College of the Ozarks.
Back to the Rob Mader Show. It's Whistleblower Wednesday, and we're talking about that very thing that Christian leaders have not been standing up over the last few decades, and how it's led to the failure of Christian institutions like universities and other things. With Dr. John West, the author of Stockholm Syndrome, Christianity. Dr. West, I wanted to show that clip there to leave the show at the end of it on a little bit of a positive, that there are still men and women out there that have the courage to stand up and be counted and stop this. But that also is based on policy. And we had that discussion in the last segment about policy transcends vision, mission. It's where policy is put together and implemented as to where these things actually happen and become reality or not, right?
Yeah, no, it is. And I'd say I think the stand that the College of the Ozarks took is great. But I would say more generally, in a lot of these institutions, even if they take a stand like that, they need to be consistent. So, and again, I'm not speaking specifically about the College of Ozarks because I don't know, but in a lot of Christian institutions that on paper, they have these stands, and they may even defend them in court, is if you actually look what's happening in the institution, what I would ask is, so are they intentionally teaching the truth about gender and sex? So what are they teaching in their chapel? What are they teaching in their classrooms? Because I will say that if you are teaching consistently in your, that's the strongest religious liberty protection you have, is on what you're actually teaching, not on the policies. And so in some of these schools, there's a disconnect. They have a policy basically because they want to keep happy with their denomination or something else. And you know, they're serious about it, but they're actually not upholding the policy or teaching students about it. So, for example, I mean, Wheaton College is a good example. Wheaton College has good stated standards on the surface. But if you look at who they bring in for chapel and other things, you know, several years ago, a number of years ago now, they had Rosaria Butterfield, who is this former lesbian who came out of that lifestyle. She's married. She's a pastor's wife. She has a wonderful testimony. And Wheaton, like a decade ago or something, had the courage to invite her, and there was a whole firestorm against her, you know, allowing her to speak. And then I think after that, there's no indication that she was invited back. My point is that the policies need to be in sync with what's actually happening on the campus. And so many of if you have a church or a Christian school, or don't think that you are just sparing yourself by avoiding talking about these things. The policy isn't enough. And in fact, sometimes courts will look and they say, well, you have this policy, but there's no indication, you know, from what you're doing that that's really actually important to you. And so they'll call your bluff. And so even just for legal reasons, if you really think that the gender madness is wrong, you need to be teaching that to students. You need to be arming them with the right facts and with information, and you need to be countercultural in your actual classrooms. And so one of the things is, your policies need to be, and your actual actions inside your organization need to be consistent.
And how does a Christian school actually implement that if they're hiring woke professors that believe in abortion and those kind of things? I mean, how is that where the major disconnect is? Maybe I missed the obvious there in this discussion.
No, it is. If you and then once you hire them, then if you try to get rid of them, but if it shows that you have not been upholding your standards for a long time, you've given them a legal argument as to, that you say historically that these are your standards, but they haven't really been, enforcing them. So you're not really as religious as you think. But you're much stronger legally, and I'd say morally and ethically, if, your walk and talk match. And so, the hiring of the people, you don't have a Christian institution. If 70%, say at Seattle Pacific, where I used to teach, 72% of the faculty now reject biblical marriage, how do you have a Christian institution with that? Well, the answer is you don't. I mean, because what's going on in the classroom is based off of their views. And so the only way that you can get it back is by replacing those faculty or by hiring new ones. I mean, this is a measure of prudence. If you have 5 or 6 years, there will be natural retirements and people leaving. And so I'm not saying go in and fire everyone, but you can be, if you're intentional, if a board is intentional about hiring good people over a 5 or 6 year period, you can change the entire culture of an institution. But that is, you have to hire good people, and don't just ask for glittering generalities. Oh, I have a personal faith. Ask about the specifics of the top 5 to 10 things that are culturally consequential now that will help bring out what their real worldview is.
Yeah, the reason I picked that clip with Eric Metaxas is because the gentleman was talking about abortion in the beginning of human life in Christ, and Christ's experience at the beginning of his human life. So you're saying, that would be a great question to ask for a prospective professor at a Christian university, wouldn't it?
Yeah, no, it would be. But again, most of, in fairness to a lot of these, there are some faculty who hide their views, but I've been on job search committees. I chaired them both in churches and at my university. And you can ascertain, if you ask the right questions, first of all, a faculty member doesn't want to be hired someplace that then they're going to be let go. So if you make it clear and ask the tough questions and look at what they're saying on social media and other things, you can determine what their views are. I mean, not 100%, but often it happens because you're not asking these specific questions. Like at my institution in the later years, it was just very general. So give your private faith journey, and as long as you knew the right lingo, you didn't have to get specific. Mm-hmm. And that is, the specificity is your friend. And you don't need to ask them on everything. I'd say whether it be life issues or DEI issues or sexuality issues, there are some key things that or biblical authority issues and the truth, absolute truth of the Bible, that if you ask those questions, they're going to give you a lot of insight into a lot of other things.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Dr. West, we've come to the end of our show. Please tell folks where they can go find the book at the various places and find you on social media. I know you're out there. And I just want to thank you so much for doing what you have done over your career. But this book is really important that we get it into the hands of parents, policymakers, board members that say they're Christian and want to live that biblical worldview, because we can turn this around, can't we?
We can. And in one of the chapters, I give 21 things people can do, whether you're a grandparent, a parent, a pastor, or a board member. So I'd encourage people to go to the book's website, StockholmSyndromeChristianity.com. If you want to get the book directly, Amazon.com or BarnesandNoble.com. But the book's website, StockholmSyndromeChristianity.com, has a lot of additional information, a lot of free information in the resources section. Even if you don't get my book, I hope you'll get the book. But even if you don't, there's a lot of free information there, and my links to my Twitter account and other things like that.
Well, thank you, sir. God bless you. We appreciate it. Keep up the good fight. I'm with you, I know. Tomorrow is Truth Thursday. here on the Rob Mena Show at Worldview Tube. And we're talking with Holly Cason, and the subject is about NGO lawfare, non-governmental organization lawfare. And of course, that's everywhere too. We got to get some truth out about that. I'll see you then on Worldview Tube.
You are watching Worldview 2, built on the 35 years of Worldview books, documenting